Hey, I'm David. This is Justice. Say hi, Justice.
Hello.
And we're both developers at Ouroboros Studios, which is making some kind of RPG kind of game-like thing. We're looking for a programmer, some person who's never had a programming job in their life on a game, who might want to work with us using Unity and C# and might be interested in things like UI, and hopefully has maybe a little bit of like project experience on their own under their belt. So if you're interested in some kind of thing like that, come and find me and we can talk about it. Or that guy. And other than that, if you want to give us money, that's cool too. He's a musician, I'm a writer, but that doesn't have anything to do with the announcement. Okay, bye.
Hey everybody, my name is Sean. I'm from Well Up Pets, and our mission is to make learning about health fun for kids. One of our first games is for asthma care, and the project we're currently working on is for food allergies, and we're currently looking for a 2D artist and animator to join our company for the next quarter. So if you are interested, if you know someone who's looking for this position, let me know. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Les Nelkin. It's awesome standing here with the slide on my face because I probably look like a character from Fury Road. So, yeah. I teach at Fitchburg State University, but I also work on games. And I'm working on a game project. It's a sci-fi narrative-based Unity game. And we need a Unity programmer, unlike the previous people. We want someone or need someone who's got some experience, also experience dealing in terms of some of the art pipeline related to performance and programming and that sort of stuff. So if you're interested, this could be a good opportunity. I'm not going to say that there's actually money involved yet, but there could be down the road, and that's how these things work out. Also, it's not really heavy duty in terms of tech, so it doesn't require like a ton of programming. It is a narrative-based game, and that's all. Anyone?
Hey, I'm Jacob of Woo Gamepile, and here's Mike. He's going to tell you about our cool event coming up on Thursday.
Yep, so we are the Woo Gamepile. We're a collective of developers in the Worcester area. We hold monthly meetups, and we have one coming up on Thursday, actually. It's at the Running Start at 95 Prescott Street. And we have Alex Engel, Sarah Como, and Dave Denton joining us for a talk about Disruptor Beam. So definitely stop by. If anyone has any questions where it is, it's a Facebook group if you need more information, or you can find any of us today, and we'll tell you all about it.
Also, gamepile.org.
Gamepile.org. Thank you.
Hey guys, how you doing? I'm Renzo. I bring the video equipment that blocks... Sorry guys. I'm Renzo. I bring the video equipment that blocks everybody's view. Yeah, thank you. Oh, thank you. One announcement. Me, Oleg Brodsky, and Maxine Rock, we've started a podcast called First Person Student. It's a game development podcast, basically meant to let people know like what goes into game design. And the key thing we're trying to do is get feedback from you guys. What is going to make a game design podcast good? What makes it fun? What's going to make it awesome? Do we sound good? Do we sound like robots? What can make it better? We'd love to hear feedback from you guys. If you want to go, basically just go to fps-podcast.blogspot.com. Give us feedback, give a listen, and yeah, let us know what you think. Thank you.
Everybody, I'm Melissa from Harmonix, and oh, damn, thank you. So I just wanted to tell you about some job openings we have at Harmonix. We have openings in our engineering and publishing department. We're currently looking for a graphics engineer, as well as a media intern in publishing and a web developer. So if you have any interest, please go on our website. If you got questions, please come see me after Seth's talk, because you know he's supposed to be keeping quiet while he's speaking. So thank you very much for that. So yeah, come find me later on tonight. Thanks. Anybody else?
Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. So my name's Alex. I'm on the board for Boston Postmortem. With me is Melissa, and both of us are, or all three of us are on the board for Boston Postmortem. Tonight, we have Seth for Proletariat. He is here to give a presentation about this little game called, what was it called again? I don't know. It didn't get any exposure or anything like that. It's called... Nice. Okay. So anyway, Seth's here to talk to us, give postmortem. I think that's about it. I'm just going to pass it over to you. Go for it.
Thank you guys very much for coming out. This is awesome to have this many people in here. So I will just dive right in. I have a lot of slides to get through, so I might go a little bit fast, but this is going to be recorded and be available on YouTube. And I think we will know where to view it at some point. And you can email me at the end for these slides if you want them. So I'm going to be just wanted to give a quick disclaimer at the start here. Whenever I do these things, I like to sort of give a little bit of a disclaimer at the beginning, just so everyone knows where we're at. This is not going to be a traditional postmortem. I'm basically going to be talking about some of our lessons learned during the live operations of the game, which is going to be a little bit different depending on the type of game you run, but that's basically going to be the focus. This is just one perspective, so do not take anything that I say here as the right way to do it. It may not be for you, because every team is different and every game is different. And this is just take this as one other tool in your toolbox. So do not take this as the only way things are done. And then this is one of the characters from World Zombination that hopefully will be releasing soon. A quick summary of what we're going to be covering. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are, the game itself. We have to cover a little bit on business models and do a little bit of math. Then I'm going to talk about some examples and the data-driven design stuff, which is the thing that I think is most important here. If you take nothing else out of this, pay attention during that part. Don't worry, it's the majority of the talk. And then we'll talk a little bit about lessons learned. So just quickly, who is Proletariat? So there's 20 of us. We sublet space from Harmonix. We're lucky enough to share some space with them, and that's been great. And so we are located just a few blocks away in Central Square right now, and then we'll be moving to Boston very soon. But so the team started out as 5, and now we're about 20. So what about World Zombination? So we started developing that game in May of 2013. We released it into beta. So we did a geo-locked launch on iOS into New Zealand and Australia in May of 2014. We released it worldwide in February of 2015, and then on Android in May. So we've been out, a few months now on both platforms. So we were lucky enough to get the Editor's Choice feature from Apple, and that was very exciting. And then we also got the Best of February on the iPad from Apple as well. So we made a game. So in order to kind of discuss some of the stuff that goes on here, I need to talk a little bit about the free-to-play business model and how it works and why. So let's talk a little bit about that. So the idea behind free-to-play is that you market the game to a specific target audience. That audience then, the game is so fun, they stay in the game for a long time. You give them a bunch of options that they can then spend money on in order to make their experience better. And then you end up with the fact that you are releasing new content all the time, that those customers stay. So then you get, there's the sort of dream. This was our April Fool's Day joke in World Zombination. We made a unit called Pay to Win. So there's some theory behind this as to why this business model is good. And it's important to touch on this just because I feel like this gets muddy a lot of times when people think about it. But basically the idea here, in comparison to what the premium model is that marketing should be easier. The game is free, so you should be able to get more people into your game. If that's not happening, or if you don't think you can do that, then it's questionable whether or not you should be using a free-to-play model. If your game is not multiplayer, I question whether or not you should be using this, just because the whole point is that having it be multiplayer and having it be highly social will drive a bunch of organics in, because you need lots of people. Less than 5% of your players are ever going to give you money. because you are actually giving players more opportunities to pay in varying amounts, they should pay more. So if your game can't support that, might not be the right thing for you. The idea is that it's almost a pay what you want model, right? Like they can spend money however they see fit. And then the whole goal is to make this into a service-based game. If you can't actually build that, then this might not be the right thing to do. So that's the kind of theory behind how you would do free-to-play. So now we need to do a little bit of math, and we need to cover a little bit of verbiage here so that everyone's on the same page. There's 4 important parts to how free-to-play works in terms of the math. There's your cost per install. This is like, how much does it cost to get a user when you pay Facebook or a YouTube streamer or Twitter or whoever to actually install a user for you? How much does that cost? The almighty K factor. This is your organic ratio. What this means is for every user you buy, you get some amount of people for free. That's through word of mouth, through keyword searching, through your position on the App Store, through any number of things. Then you have retention. This is how fun is the game. If the game is super fun and people play it for a really long time, that's great. What is the average number of days that a player plays your game? Then you have revenue, which is what is the average amount of money that a payer spends per day. So now we need to get into the actual math. So we combine the average days that a player stays times the average revenue per day to get our lifetime value. That is like what effectively you would charge for the game if you were letting people buy it premium. Then you have your effective cost per install. This is your marketing cost. So it's not only just your cost per install, but because your game is highly social and because it's driving a lot of organics, you get this K factor boost to help you out. So that's where you get your effective cost per install. So your lifetime value, so the amount of money that a player spends minus the amount of money that it takes to market the game to them is your overall profit. So this is important when thinking about the way these games need to work. Similar to premium titles, it's just the same way. If you can't market your game for less than what you're selling it for, you are not going to make money. So I want to talk a little bit now about how we approach running games live. How many people remember the scientific method from school? Anybody remember doing this? Good, yeah. US public schools at their best. So scientific method has a number of steps here, and it actually maps really well to the way Proletariat runs the process of running a game live. You have a number of different steps, which I'll walk through, and I want to talk about them in terms of data-driven design. So a lot of people are like, oh my God, metrics, like analytics, they're the devil, they take away all the creativity. Like, that's not true. We will walk through plenty of areas where that is not the case. You can't optimize a bad game to be good. You just can't. You need to actually, your game needs to have a soul. You need to actually have some amount of design ability on your team in order to do this. This doesn't just work with just looking at the metrics. That's not a crystal ball. And I'll show you why. So when we look at the scientific method and we look at that compared to data-driven design, how does that break out for like the way, so this is the way Proletariat operates. So we look at a purpose. We choose a goal. The goal for all 3 of the examples I'm going to give you tonight are the exact same. It's always retention. It's always, can we make the game more fun? Then we actually study the game. So we actually track a bunch of metrics in the game, and we look at them. We actually look at our data all the time, and I would recommend you to do the same thing. And this doesn't have to be large scale like what Proletariat does, where we track a lot of things in the game. It can be as simple as like you're watching user tests, player tests, like that sort of thing, and getting your data from there. Wherever you're collecting data, just make sure that you are. Then you need to create a hypothesis. So this is where we cross the line from like just straight science to the art side. This is where you actually need to try to design something. You need to actually think like what makes sense to solve this problem. This is like the creativity bit. Same with the experiment. Now you actually need to build that thing you were just talking about and release it, because you need to get it live in order to actually get any data back. Then again, you need to actually have the information ready so that you can know what exactly is happening. And then you need to tie that all back together. It's important to take time to do this step. I know that there are a lot of developers that I've talked to that don't take this time to actually analyze what a feature did to figure out if it actually is moving them towards their goal. So let's talk about some examples. So we're going to do 3 of these. The first one's longer than the other 2, so please bear with me. So we'll start from the beginning. Here's what we want to, here's the steps through the process. So we need to figure out what is the goal. I already spoiled this a little bit earlier. We want to increase lifetime value by increasing retention. Why not revenue? Revenue is the more you can get a player to stick around, the easier it is to get them to pay. So if you think about this in a very cynical way, you want to try to increase the retention on your game for that reason alone. But really, you just want to make the game more fun. Retention is harder to move, but if you can move it, it matters so much more. And so we care much more about retention than we do about revenue, and it's because retention is the harder thing to move, but if you can, it makes such a big difference. And really, it's just a matter of how fun and how understandable your game is. So there you go. Step 1. Our purpose is always to raise LTV by increasing retention. So now we got to look for opportunities. What are opportunities for us to actually create features that could then increase this, this actual metric, that can actually increase retention? So this is where we also end up like stepping into the shoes of kind of solving a mystery. This is when we sit down and brainstorm and we look at numbers and we look at data and we look at what players are doing and we try to figure out what is going on. So for this particular example, we stumbled across the problem that players were dropping off very early. So we had good day 1 retention in World Zombination when we first started, but day 2 was miserable. And we couldn't figure out why. It didn't make any sense. Players come in on day 0, they come back on day 1, and then they just they've had enough. So why is that happening? So we have to ask ourselves, like what is going on? What is going on that is making them do that? Why do we think that's happening? And then for a healthy player, what do we expect them to actually do? So now we need to actually start to think about, like, what do we want them to do? What are we incentivizing them to do through the game? And what would be our ideal situation? So we start asking questions. So this is part of the ask a question, go look it up in the data, see where you are, ask another question, see where it leads. So we said, like, all right, our players progressing through different cities. So in World Zombination, you start in Seattle. You go from Seattle to San Francisco to Vancouver to New Orleans to Mexico City, and you just like go all the way through. No matter what side you play, human or zombies, that's the way the progression works. So we asked, like, are players going through the different cities? Yes, they were. Are they going on missions? They seem to be starting missions. That doesn't seem to be a problem. They're finishing missions. That also doesn't seem to be a problem. So maybe it's not that. But then there was a question of, like, wait a minute, are they losing a lot? So, like, you know, if you're 20 minutes, 30 minutes into a game and you all of a sudden start losing constantly, is that fun? Is that something you want to see? So we looked that up in the data, and it turns out that, like, yeah, they were losing a lot. So this is the data that we have for early game missions. So you can see that 90% success rate in San Francisco, you know, like 80% in Vancouver, and then wow, it just like falls off a cliff for New Orleans and Mexico City. Like, that is not fun. And this is like overall total number of missions. This is not like losing once. This is like you lose more than half the time, and you're like less than an hour into the game. So players are losing a lot. That seems like a problem. So there's a question. Now we have to figure out, like, all right, like, why? Why is this happening? So one of the things that's interesting about World Zombination, because you can play as either the survivors or the infected, we actually have like a built-in test to see like if content is too hard. Like, are both sides losing? Maybe it's just zombies. Maybe just zombie players are getting screwed. Like, that content is way too difficult. That wasn't the case. Then we thought, like, is there like something specific about, you know, a map or two? So the content in World Zombination is all procedurally generated. Maybe there's something bad in the way that random generator is working that is causing a few of the seeds to produce bad maps. That wasn't the case. Then we said, like, all right, well, what about, like, are we introducing any new mechanics in New Orleans or Mexico City that we didn't teach players? Is it something like that? No. Then we brought up this question of, like, are players properly prepared? And this is interesting because players will almost always at this state, like, blame you if they don't feel like they're prepared, like blame the game designer if they don't feel like they're prepared to take on a challenge. So it's up to you to make sure that they are prepared. So we were like, all right, like, what does that mean? Does that mean that they're trained enough? Does that mean they understand the mechanics? What does that mean? And we started asking ourselves, like, by the time you get to New Orleans, we expect you to actually be taking part in the metagame, which means you're leveling up your team. You're actually increasing the level of your units. So a team in World Zombination is 7 units, and you're actually increasing their level. We expect that by the time you get to New Orleans because you face off against an entire team of level 2 units. As it turns out, players were not upgrading. You can see that like more than 50% of players were actually coming in with a level 1 team, having done 0 upgrades. That's a problem because they're facing off against all level 2s. So then we took a look at like, okay, what's the win rate like? Well, you can see that when they try it at level 1, they're losing almost all the time. But if they're trying it at much higher levels, they're winning. So if we can actually, so the players that are actually trying that, over half the players are losing 30%, or like, only winning 30% of the time. So we obviously need them to upgrade more in order to make this win more. So now we have to ask ourselves, like, all right, like, why are they not upgrading? So we looked at that mechanic. What's going on with that mechanic? So at the time, upgrading used a consume mechanic. This is basically like, has anyone played like a CCG where they do this sort of thing? So basically like what happens is you need 2 units to level up a unit from level 1 to level 2. So a team has 7 units, I mentioned that before. By New Orleans, you have exactly 14 extra units. That means that you needed to consume all of them to be on par with the team you were facing in New Orleans. That's a problem. What we found was by the time that you actually get there, no one was doing this. And in reality, it was so early in the game that players didn't feel comfortable consuming their units. And we saw this through some of the playtests we were doing where no one felt okay about consuming a unit because they didn't realize that these were just common units and they would get like, uncommons and rares and legendaries later on. And so these were all garbage. They could just consume them because it was too early in the game. So this is what the UI looked like at the time, and this is the way the feature kind of worked, is you would pick units on the side there, and they would end up down in this area, and you would consume. And it turned out that just didn't work. I know Mike Soltoff's laughing at this because this was his like really old UI. Remember what that used to look like? This is months ago. So we were able to do some research and figure out an opportunity, right? We basically found that players are losing a ton because they're not upgrading. So that's a good opportunity. So now we have to like come up with a hypothesis here. How do we fix this problem? So this is a multi-part one. If players upgrade more units, they'll win more missions. We already saw that pretty clearly in the data, that like players that were higher upgraded on New Orleans would win more. Like the players that were at like 2.4 for their average unit player level, like were killing it. And then if we increase win percentage, that will tie back into retention. Because always like we are chasing retention, right? That was the purpose. So what we're looking for is what ties back up to that. So there we go. That's our hypothesis. So what do? Is we built a new feature and we taught it. So now we actually walk you through, we force it, we make it mandatory for you to actually do some upgrades. So we like walk you through like, hey, you go into like the evolve chamber, you click on it, you level it up. We actually got rid of the consume mechanic entirely and we just used the actual currency in the game. So we just like ditched that whole mechanic. And then we actually like reinforced it. We said like, hey, you should always be upgrading all the time. You never want to have a unit not upgrading. You want to have something in your upgrade chambers every moment that you have. So we then end up with this experiment like going through, and now we release that live. So we build that feature and we release it. So the question is like, how does it do? So we make you upgrade twice in the like first time user experience. But that doesn't account for all the upgrades we're seeing now. So you can see the shift, right? This is the average players in New Orleans are actually going in at, what is that? 2.7 now. So they're actually like closer to level 3 units. And that's great. Like that was exactly what we wanted. And then we look at like, okay, did that impact win rates? So now we're like walking through the other part of our hypothesis. Like, yes, they are winning a lot more. It turns out that like that is directly impacting win rates. So you can see that like, now our win rates are much higher in Mexico and New Orleans especially. So great, we did the analysis, like we did the first part, that's great. Now can we tie it all back together? Like let's tie that all in. So does that impact retention? And yes, it does. So it turns out that day 7 retention was bumped by almost 50% because of this change. So that shows you like we were able to tie that back in and actually like drastically increase the overall retention for the game. So that ties up the conclusion. So what do we learn here? So it's really important to track and measure player behavior. So we're able to do this because we put a lot of effort into actually being able to figure out exactly what's going on in the game. I recommend that all of you do as much as you can because this stuff can be really valuable. Now, there is a limit. If you can't act on a metric, it's not a good one. So keep that in mind. So pick the things that are specific to your game, try to really understand it. And that's sort of what kind of brings us to the next point, which is you really want to know how your game works. And it's not enough to have just designed it because your game will evolve over time, especially if you're working with a team. You may not have that whole game in your head at every moment. So you need to be just always thinking about it, playing it, understanding what's going on. You need to ask a lot of questions. So we do this all the time. You know, we will observe something, which we'll talk about next. We will see something in the game. We will see a curious blip in our data in like the way we actually do reporting, where we just like report what's going on in the game every day and every week. And we will find interesting things and then chase those to just see what's going on. Because you want to try to understand how players are using your game, which is almost always not going to be how you would. If a mechanic is essential, you should force it. This is one of the things that I think is really important in terms of teaching a tutorial. You really want to, whenever you can, if players absolutely have to do it, fit it into the narrative, make it work, make them do it. They're not going to do it on their own. They're not going to understand it. Players expect that sort of thing. And then whenever possible, reinforce it. And I don't just mean through a pop-up. I don't just mean through a tooltip. I mean actually try to set it in context as to why you'd want to level these units up to actually do better. Whenever you can do this in context, like that's going to hit home much better. So that was example number 1. So good, that was the long one. So now we're going to go into guild recommendation. So again, start from the top. So what is the goal? Like I said, the goal is always the same. It's always to raise LTV by increasing retention. So we got our purpose. So this came out of an observation. This came out of our head of product playing in a guild and being like, man, our guild has dropped off and it's just not as fun. It's just not as fun to play right now because we have like a lot of inactive players sitting in our guild. And so he said that, you know, it's not great. Like my experience is definitely worse than it was a couple of weeks ago. And then we had this theory, he like left that guild, so he mentioned this. And we were like, oh, that seems kind of interesting. He mentioned this and he left that guild and went to a highly active one after like spamming it on the forums and in chat, like trying to find a place for him to go because he's a high level player. And it turns out that it was way more fun. When he got into a new guild, he was like, this was awesome. And so we were like, all right, like let's look into that. Is that happening to more people than just you? So it turns out it definitely was. We had this huge spike because we got this huge feature from Apple where we had tons of active users, millions of players, and then they slowly decline over time. This is kind of expected. This is what you would expect. The problem is that you want guilds to actually be kicking out inactive players and bringing in active ones if the guild is still active. So you actually want this to be flat. So that's a problem. So players are churning over time and they're not being replaced. The average guild members are down 45% from when we started. It's a real problem. So then there was this assumption that social mechanics are suffering because of this. We assumed that like guild raids are getting successfully completed less often, that chat is more barren, and that units aren't being shared as much and aren't being borrowed as much. So that's a real issue. So then we got a question of like, now we got to start asking ourselves again, like, why is this happening? What is going on? Do guilds realize they actually have inactive players? It turns out they didn't. We didn't have any mechanism to show them that. Are guilds trying to recruit active players? Yeah, I mean, they're spamming chat all the time trying to get this. They're posting on the forums, so it seems like they're trying to do it. Can active players find active guilds? So this is an interesting question, which brought us to like, wait a minute, how are players going into guilds at all? We didn't even look at this. We didn't even try to figure out like, wait, how are they joining guilds? And so this brought us into almost 90% of players that are level 10, which is about 5 to 7 days into the game, depending on how hardcore you are in a guild. That's awesome. That is an awesome, awesome stat. That means that like a lot of people are interacting socially in the game, which is one of the things we tried to build in. 80% of them join straight through the recommendation page. This is probably unsurprising to a lot of people, but we put up this recommendation when you open the guild screen where we recommend you a bunch of guilds. The problem is that only like the average guild is only has 8 daily active users there. We actually want you to be at like 15 to 20 is sort of like where we think is a good active guild. So that's a real problem. That means our guild recommendation system is hurting. Then 10% of players at level 3-ish, they're able to start creating guilds, and they started about level 3 going up to level 10. About 10% of them create their own guilds from scratch. Now you can obviously see why this is a problem, because they may drop off because they're not that engaged, and then they're now abandoning a whole guild of people that then join. So we don't want that either. And then there were some people that were joining through search and chat, but that was, considerably less. So we found this problem. Guild DAU is decaying over time. That seems like something we can probably fix. So now we have a 3-part hypothesis here. If players get better guilds through the recommendation system, they will join them. This is pretty straightforward. It means that, like, do you think recommendation systems and the default option works? Then we said, if we add a cost to creating a guild, that will mean that fewer people will create them, so they will actually in turn join active guilds themselves. And then the overall thought was, by increasing active guilds, we will increase retention. So that was the design. That was the idea. So then we made some changes. So we did some changes to the guild recommendation system. The old algorithm would just take the largest guilds, the guilds that were closest to being full, which it's full 50 people. So guilds that were like 48, 49 people would be the only ones that were ever shown in the active spot, but they could have been dead for months, and they would still show up there. So what we did instead is we actually looked at how active you were in the last 7 days, and that's how we created this system. So this brought up our recommendation system from giving you guilds that were about 8 daily active users to 27 daily active users. And then we put a cost on guild creation, straight up. We put a cost that would be unattainable to a level 3, but more attainable to like a level 10, just so you were more engaged in the game before you started a guild. So then we built that and we released it. So how did that work? Well, it worked really well. So here's that line right there is when we released the actual feature. So you can see that we went from, what we ended up doing is we actually raised the average active guild members by 40%, just through this recommendation system. So then the question is like, okay, how did that impact the actual social features? Like, does making guilds more active impact that? And like, yes. So the overall like players completing guild raids went up drastically. So that line right there is when we did that. So now 40% more players are actually completing guild raids. They're actually like doing a successful social thing together, which we thought was super important to like being fun in the game. Like the most fun parts are doing these raids. So great, that worked. So then some of the question is like, all right, now that we have that, did this actually impact retention? Now, day 30 is complicated. The reason why is because there's a lot of things that can happen with 30-day retention that makes it very difficult to know if it's one specific thing. So when you're doing this, it can be very challenging to tease out the exact things that caused a change, because there are real environmental impacts. There are things like seasonality, like what happens over Christmas, what happens in the summer when like kids are off school. Day 30 is impacted more than most others in this way, and so it can be really difficult to try and know exactly what you're doing, not to mention if you actually are releasing multiple features in a single release. It can be really hard to know what was the thing that actually worked. But what we can tell here is that day 30 retention went up. And we think it has something to do with this guild recommendation feature, mainly because this was done as a solo hotfix itself without having another like major feature released during that time. And so we went up by 37% in day 30 retention here. So it turns out that this one worked. So what did we learn from this one? I think this is incredibly important. This is one of the things that is really, really hard to do if you are playing your game all the time. It becomes hard to actually have an objective opinion on what's going on, but you need to do it. And not only that, but you need to sort of you need to approach it with a sort of hunger, because you want to be looking for opportunities inside of it, inside of your game. You don't want to be just seeing what the status quo is, understanding what's going on. You want to be actually seeing what could potentially be fixed, what could potentially be added. And it's a hard mentality to get into, but it's so important, because this is where you can find a lot of these things that you wouldn't find just by combing through the data or just by reading the forums, right? You need to actually experience it yourself to know. This may seem really straightforward, but this is always important to mention. If you give people a default option, if you recommend them stuff, they will use it almost all of the time. And that's really important. The other thing I would mention is that keeping a healthy community is a constant struggle. Like, we saw this sort of decline in day 30 when we were initially looking at this. And we kind of like thought that maybe it was just seasonality or something weird. We weren't really sure what it was. Like, there wasn't really any changes in the people that we were having install the game. There wasn't like a whole bunch of installs coming in from different regions. And the reality is that like some of these forces work without you ever releasing a feature. So something like this, like the social structure inside the game, was just going to decay over time no matter what we did. And so we need to find ways to try and fix that to actually increase like the people that were active staying in guilds. And this is one of the things where even if you don't change anything in your game, things might still decline. So you need to watch that and be careful about what's going on. So I'm going to get to the last one. So, as always, the purpose is the same. So, I want to talk quickly about the first-time user experience. That's what's the acronym there, the FTUI, as it is called. Basically, we look at this funnel a lot. The reason why is the barrier to entry in free-to-play games is very low. The game is free. What that means is that no one's invested in your game. I mean, how many people have like bought a $60 game and started to play it and been like, I hate this game and I'm getting my $60 out of it? How many people? Come on, more than that, yeah. That doesn't happen in free because you download a free game and you're like, this game sucks, I'm never going back to it, because you have no initial investment to start. So that beginning first-time user experience is so important. And so we look at it a lot. So this is a little bit smooth, but basically what this is showing is where the drop-off is over time. So 100% of the users start at the beginning, and then what percent of users end up at the end. And so we sort of like pick our own, what we consider the first-time user experience. But a lot of these people are not gone forever. Like, they may just take a break. There's natural drop-off points of like, they finish a mission, and they want to come back later, and that naturally happens. But the longer you can keep people engaged, the better it is, usually. But what you're looking for are drop-offs that occur that seem weird. So you expect people to drop off when there's a natural endpoint, a mission ends, right? You finish a game, you don't want to start the next one. But when you see drop-offs in things where there is no decision point, or there is no choice, there is no actual like difficult thing, there's no gameplay, it's just you have to click yes and you have to go forward. If you're losing people during those times, you should examine that. So what we were seeing is that players were starting to drop off in places where we didn't expect them to. We sort of thought it would be easy for them to navigate to the next mission if they wanted, or to find where they needed to go on the world map. So we asked all those questions. I'm not going to put them up again as to like what we did, but we went through the same process where we just start asking questions and then looking in the data, digging through, seeing what we could find. And so we started to look at early mission drop-off. So when we look at what actually is happening here, there's sort of a bunch of different things. So during the mission itself, this is players install the game. They're like, whoa, I did not expect this to be a tower defense game. I don't like tower defense games, I'm out. Or I don't like the way this game looks, or whatever the reason is, right? That the mission one is during gameplay. So when the mission starts, like during that game. Load time. This is a natural drop-off point for free games, right? People are like, oh, it's going to take 3 minutes to download. Nope, I don't care, right? You laugh, but it happens all the time. The meta is sort of what happens in between stuff. Like, you know, when you're outside of a mission, what's sort of going on there. For the early game, there's like no decisions here. There's nothing interesting. So we want that to be as low as possible. We are like putting a giant yellow arrow in front of you to direct you where you need to go. So we don't want any drop off there. Mission end is a really strange one because mission end is like when you collect your rewards and it's just a click through. So that seems really weird. And then even stranger is people actually starting the next mission, which there's a natural drop-off that you'd expect sort of like at, you know, getting the rewards and being done. But if you're already back out of that, going on to the next mission, that feels like a massive drop-off for something that shouldn't have it. So the question was like, okay, if players are dropping off between completing missions and completing cities, what's going on? So this is where you need to actually take the time to analyze your own game and sort of think critically about like what is a player seeing. This is why it's important to understand how your game works. So we have the world map. That doesn't look confusing at all, right? It turns out that, you know, we sort of thought like, yeah, that would be super straightforward. Players would know what to click. That's not too busy. And we look at it now like, of course it fucking is. Are you kidding me? And a lot of this is because you need to actually like want the data kind of point you in this direction, and then it becomes crystal clear that like, oh my God, we missed this the whole time. We thought it was just good enough. And that is such a trap you end up in when you're developing a game where you're like, yeah, that's good enough to get by because we have a million other fires to put out. And it turns out that like that's not always the case. And data can help show you where that is. But now you still need to design an actual feature that cleans that thing up. That is not a simple problem, right? You have multiple things going on here. You have the actual campaign missions. Those are the dudes that are running. You have the guild raids. So that's what Honolulu and Los Angeles is. And then you have things like Chicago, which are limited time battles where the humans and zombies are facing off for a certain amount of time, and that city rotates. So it's not always the same city. So there's a lot of data to display, and the question is, there's a lot of data to display to the player, and then there's a lot of questions on what you actually want them to do next. Like right when they join a guild, you definitely want them to do a guild raid. When they get old enough to actually compete in like something like Chicago, you want them to actually be doing that because then they're competing against other players in something that really matters. Like it's one of the unique things about World Zombination. The entire community can go head to head in a faction-based fight. Right? It was one of the things that we thought was super interesting about the game. So there's a lot of questions on how you actually design this. And it turns out that we had a 12% drop here just because people couldn't find out what the next thing was they wanted to do. That felt like a problem to us. That felt like something that we could fix. So we have city progression. So as you go through a city, you get victory points. That's what that trophy is over there on the left. The problem is the way we were representing it was super boring. It was like you fill up that bar and then you complete San Francisco. Right? It was like, wow, like that is like the most abstract way of thinking about it. That's like not really, you know, it turns out that like the more things you can tie to real life, the better off you are. Because players come in with a preconceived notion of what they expect. And so if you can actually like make this look like a city or explain how they might traverse through it, that will have much more impact than if you did it with a bar that's filling up. Not to mention that we don't show you how many points you'll get from actually doing a mission. And we don't really do a good job of explaining like why the hell you care about those rewards. So it really wasn't great. And we were losing 13% of people on this. And that felt like a lot. So that was our next opportunity. So we had this drop off and we felt we could fix it in between cities and in between missions. So now it's another 3-part hypothesis here. So the world map was confusing. Players didn't know where to go, is what we're saying. Players are not excited about actually completing a city because the rewards aren't interesting and they don't feel like they're making progress. Filling a bar is not fun. Reducing the early drop-off between missions and between cities will increase our retention. So this is where we tie it all back. You always need that, right? You always need the thing that ties it all back in. So there was our hypothesis. So we redesigned the world map. So we stripped everything down so that you would only see the thing that you needed to do. We pulled things out so it was easy to find when you wanted to do PvP, when you wanted to do a guild raid, when you wanted to do a faction war. We tutorialized it. We did a bunch of work to make it smartly recommend things to do at the right times. Like the first time a guild raid's opened up, you're told to go do it. And we added this dotted line that showed you where the campaign was going to be, so you felt like you were making progress through that whole thing. So this was a lot of work. And then the cities, we made it a map, right? So it's not an actual map of Mexico City. What we did is we made it a treasure map of sorts. We added in actual reasons for you to complete the next mission. So like those, like that DNA and that coin, those are rewards you'll get for completing that mission. So you want to do like just one more to get there. And then that thing at the very end is like what you get for completing the city. So that's actually a new upgrade for your hero unit on the zombie side. And so this felt way more compelling. We even added in a little bit of narrative. Like that's what that thing up at the top is. So you go through 6 days of being in Mexico City and you follow a little bit of a narrative, and we sort of like tease out some of the units in the game during that time. So we built this thing and we released it. So how did it do? So an overall city map drop off, when we look at San Francisco, we drastically reduced it. So the overall city map drops between 30 to 70% in San Francisco, which is great because that's the second city in the game. The first city is Seattle, and you don't even see the world map at that time. You're walked through something totally different. So there was a question of like, all right, well, how about at the world map? So the overall drop off that we saw was that when we look at mission ends, we look at starting the next mission, that dropped considerably. When we look at how you actually made progress, that was up crazy amounts. That was awesome. So overall, we were able to reduce the drop-off in between missions and in between cities by 45%. And progress on day 0 through the first-time user experience by 30%. We increased it by 30% through. We were so excited. We were like, yes, here we go. So we definitely saw that like these changes directly impacted those metrics we were going after. They directly changed the progression. They directly changed the drop-off. Mission accomplished. Turns out that was not the case. There was 0 impact on day 7 retention. Day 7 retention actually went down slightly. Well, it turns out that you still can learn something from this. So we did not, even though we moved those metrics forward, this did not actually make a change to retention. So that tells you a whole bunch of things. Like, yes, it's sad that this didn't impact retention because we spent a bunch of time doing it. But on the other side of it, that tells you a whole bunch more about your game. You've now learned a whole bunch more of like, all right, well, if that wasn't the issue, what is? If players are getting much farther into the game and then deciding they don't like it, why? Because now they're getting much farther. 30% farther on the first day, that's a lot farther than what they're getting before. So why are they still not liking your game? So there's a whole bunch of questions that lead away from that. So what were our lessons learned? Aspiration and metaphor are important. You want to make it really clear what players are going to get, and the more you can actually use a metaphor like a treasure map or making it really clear on the world map with a dotted line, Indiana Jones style, the better off you'll be. Trying to actually make things that players understand in the real world is way better than doing abstractions like victory points and bars that fill up, because players will just naturally understand this more. Communicating progress is essential. Actually showing players how they move forward is really important. We focused on that a lot with the world map and with the city map because the bar filling up was just not enough. And when you moved across the world map, it just wasn't clear like where you were actually going, what you were trying to do, how far you had to go. So we put a lot of effort into actually making that something that players would get. And we actually watched them. Not only did we take data for all of these things from our actual game, but we actually did a lot of user testing where we would have users take videos of the game like through a service called usertesting.com, and we would view those, and we would use that data as well as part of this. And then the other one that's really important to remember is that improving one metric may not improve others. And this is an understanding of how your game works. It turns out that progression through the tutorial for us is not directly tied to retention for whatever reason. And we needed to sort that out later, and we still haven't fully solved it. But it tells us something that's interesting. But it's important to realize that something that may seem clear, like, wow, we just drastically increased the number of people getting through the tutorial. That doesn't mean they're going to stick around 7 days later. So, wrapping this all up, kind of putting this all together, here is all of the lessons learned. I'm not going to read them all off. But if you care about getting them all together. There was way more lessons that we learned in terms of world domination. I just tried to pick 3 examples to not take all night. Obviously, we were working on this game for nearly 2 years before it went live, so we have tons of lessons learned. But I figured these would be interesting in terms of running a game live. So the question is, so there's some question of like, all right, well, overall, how has this process worked for you? How has data-driven design worked for Proletariat and worked for world domination? And so the best way to look at this is in terms of its day 7 retention. So since we've released the game, we've been doing this methodology. So we've been working on this process. We've been refining it. We've been getting better at it. We've been understanding our game more. We've been understanding our players more. We've been figuring out how to balance this and make it work. And we've increased day 7 by 220% since we came out in beta. And that is massive. And that is something that I think is so important if you're ever going to do a service-based game. And even if you're ever going to just develop a game, understanding a way to start doing this where you don't have to have the game live in beta, where you can do this through actually playtesting. Any way you can start to think about this in terms of small pieces that you can find hypotheses for, build experiments, and then understand your game better is going to make your design more solid. So that's it. Almost exactly 45 minutes. So I think I'll put up there'll be a blog post up on Proletariat's blog with I'll release this, this whole deck for you guys to check out. The video will be live. You can email me directly if you really want to see it, and just let me know. And I think, I don't know, do we do questions? Yeah.
Of the major changes you described here, about how long did it take for your team, once you decided this is the design idea we're going to go, how long did it take to implement them? And you may want to repeat the question for the recording.
Yeah, so the question was, when we decided what feature we wanted to build, how long did it take to implement, to actually get it out live? That depends on the feature. So something like the guild recommendation change was a week, I think, or less. That was a very easy change and massive impact, so that was great. Something like the first thing where we redid the metagame to actually remove consumption and change up the way we are actually doing unit upgrading, that took 2 months. So it really depends on what the feature was specifically. In general, we try to do a release every 4 to 6 weeks. And so some things are shorter than that. So things like the guild recommendation system didn't even need a release. We just did that as a hot fix to the server. And so we try to bucket it in terms of that. But we always try to, the product team always tries to think 1 to 2 releases ahead. So they're always searching for what the right opportunities might be and trying to spec out what those designs are so that the team can hit the ground running on the next release once they get it out. And we are always learning from the past release. So the goal is to be working on the current release, using whatever data we have, designing the next release using the past release's data, and then analyzing the previous release to make sure we fully understand what happened.
Data and metrics don't come for free. Approximately, what percentage of your development budget was spent on that for gathering data and metrics?
So the question was, data and metrics aren't free, so how much time do you spend actually developing things to track your data? It's hard to say. I mean, it's not as much as you might think because we actually just we do all of our stuff kind of custom. So we're lucky enough that our head of product can write SQL, so we just push everything to a Redshift database on Amazon, and we just have a bunch of tracking calls that we ended up putting in a long time ago. So overall, the cost to an actual feature is maybe 5 to 10% more, depending on how complicated the tracking needs to be. So for every feature we want to put in the game here, you got to add on 10% in terms of like what that would take on the back end to actually track. And we try to be pretty strict with ourselves in terms of like what tracking we actually need to make behavioral changes versus what tracking we'd actually want because it's interesting academically, which can be really hard, right? Once you have access to tons of data, it's like there's all sorts of interesting things you could look at, but that doesn't mean it's actually relevant to making your game better. Any other?
Now that you're in the live environment, how much do you think your marketing data comes back to influence your design decisions versus the design data influencing your marketing?
Do you mean the types of people we choose to market
There's
at?
data on both sides.
Right.
You can look at data from your marketing versus your in-game performance data.
So the question was about the balancing what you're seeing coming in from marketing versus what you're seeing in the game. For us, we've always focused like mostly on the game, mainly just because the marketing stuff shifts pretty consistently, and because of the featuring we got from Apple, we ended up getting a lot of organic users. So it was important to just take a look at like what, that user base was massive very quickly, like more than we could spend to actually get. So it was like, all right, we should take a look at and actually analyze these users to tell what's going on. But it's a balance between both. We end up looking at a lot of what users we're kind of targeting. And during this whole time, we're doing a very similar process. Like we run the same sort of hypothesis-driven, like scientific method process with our marketing and with the way we run our community. Like it's all the same. So we do all the same things at Proletariat, but it's definitely a balance more. The challenge with the marketing side is that you have, we try to pick one channel that we can keep consistent the whole time, because you need that to keep your data consistent. And then the rest of it is kind of experimenting on its own. And so it's sort of a balance. I mean, very early, it was all about just whatever we have in the game. Any other?
So obviously you guys have been doing like event tracking stuff from very early period of development. So how did you choose which events you were really interested in looking at and stuff you made up so early?
So the question was about how do we actually choose what to track? How do we actually look at the game and decide what events we think are important?
Did you go through a refinement process with that?
Yeah, and so like some question on how many iterations did it take to get it right? To be honest, it was mostly sitting down and trying to decide like how do we think the game works and what do we think is going to be important to the game operating? What do we think is going to drive retention? What do we think is going to drive revenue? What do we think is like actually going to drive the higher level metrics that we know can be like checked by other things? Because when you're running your own analytics, you got to make sure you didn't make a bug. And so, for the most part, spend a couple weeks like figuring out what we think was going to be important. Like our head of product kind of like spearheaded that and listed out like, hey, here are all the things that I think are going to be important for us to track in order to see what's going on. A lot of that experience came from when we were running games inside of Zynga, which was a lot of this, like you do a lot of the same thing. And then we are sort of always, I think, iterating on it to some degree. We're constantly trying to figure out ways to like shrink the combat table because it's massive and like find ways to actually like, figure out like we're not using this data. Like why do we keep tracking it, right? And you're not going to get it right the first time. You're going to think you want things that are just not important, and you kind of have to go into it with the mentality that it's going to be a living part of the game. Like the way you actually handle your tracking nomenclature is going to be like something that needs to be iterated on with every feature, and should be considered as to how you upkeep it. Right? You don't want it to get stale. Any other questions? Our user acquisition, there was a question about our user acquisition when we first started our geo-locked beta in New Zealand and Australia. Facebook. I think we just needed users. Like when we first launched, like we asked Apple, like, please don't feature us. Like the game is not ready for this sort of thing. and so you get very few for free. And so it was really just like, trying to start also this same process on the marketing side. Like, what are our assumptions? What are our hypotheses? What type of users do we think we want? Like, this game is kind of a mid-core strategy game. We probably want Clash of Clans users. That seems like a good place to start. Like, let's start there. And so trying to start from something like that and then only spending what we needed to actually get statistical significance, and then just kind of like doing that consistently as we were getting better at marketing and getting the game better, like having the game perform better. And so our mentality was very much like a new release would come out, we'd acquire 5,000, 10,000 users, and then we'd wait 4 to 6 to 8 weeks, and then we'd do the same thing again. We'd ride out the fact that we would get a whole bunch of organics along with that. But that was our strategy very early on. It was like minimal as possible, doing small scale experiments. One of the things I think we missed out on was that we never got enough true daily active users in the game itself to expose some of the network effect of actually like having a very active game with an active chat and a lot of active guilds. We didn't realize that active guild thing until we'd been live on worldwide for 3 months. So I think we missed out on that during the beta, and if I could do it again, we would have at least tested a few points where we had much more daily active users, so we would have spent a bunch more for that. But very early on, like the game was so broken for the first 6 weeks, it was like barely playable. So we spent as little as possible because you're throwing away all that marketing money. Any other questions?
A little bit more of a technical question. What database do you guys use to store your data? How do you scale that and how have you guys scaled that for a large amount of users?
So the question was, how do we actually scale what we use for our tracking, and especially with getting like big spikes of users, and how do we handle that? So I'm not the right person to ask about this. Like I said, we use Redshift with Amazon. All of our tracking data gets sent that direction. If you want to know all the details about it, shoot me an email, and you can talk to our director of engineering or like one of our other engineers that actually implemented this, because they'll be able to answer that more clearly for you than I will. Other than like I know that it was a pain point at one point. That's all. That's what I can tell you. There was a lot of complaining about it when we first launched. So, that's the best I can tell you. Any other questions?
Last one. Hi, outside of your, the Apple featuring, what do you think were some of your most successful forms of marketing for World Zombination, and where do you think you guys could have maybe focused a little more on?
I think the best marketing that's performed for us is Facebook video advertising. The game shows really well in video. That's ended up working extremely well for us. The other thing that's worked out really well for us is like doing deals with like YouTube and Twitch broadcasters. Like they're small scale. It's hard to scale that as an actual channel, but they drive some awesome users. And so those were the two that definitely stand out. I mean, like the thing that we're doing the most right now is definitely Facebook video, because the game just works really well in that format. All right, thank you very much, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Seth. That was great. As another data-driven company, I can basically affirm everything that was in this talk, and you should absolutely look at the slides if you get a chance. If you don't look at your data, then you are dumb. Okay, so that's it. We have this room till 10. After 10, we can go ahead and move to the front. Remember to pay your tabs, and we've got it for another hour. So thanks everyone for coming, and one last thing, next month we are working on a post-mortem barbecue. So there will be more discussion about the details of said barbecue, as well as where it's going to be held, what we're going to be eating, all the good stuff that you want to care about, primarily food related. So that's about it. Thanks to you for coming, and have a great night. Thanks everyone.